This has been one of the most difficult narratives I've worked through in recent years, because it's not an idea, a theory, or a teaching I heard from someone else, but a profound awareness following an experience within one's own inner world, an experience difficult to put into words. This narrative not only shook me, but also made me question things I hadn't questioned in a long time. When does a person truly become exhausted? How do they slowly begin to disappear without anyone touching them? And most importantly, do they do it with their own hands? One night, when my mind strayed from its usual thought patterns, I found myself in an incredibly vivid and detailed inner vision. There was a vast landscape, a dark, fertile, water-holding, life-sustaining land. This image spoke the symbolic language of the subconscious, and modern neuroscience confirms this. The human mind perceives complex realities more clearly through symbols. The land represents potential, a world yet to emerge but harboring life. Plants had begun to sprout from the soil. Long, thin, yet vibrant structures resembling cornstalks. They all seemed to have grown from the same seed, because indeed they had. This perfectly aligns with the concept in biology called genetic potential. Two plants from the same seed can yield completely different results depending on environmental conditions. And these plants symbolically represented human life. Initially, most of the plants sprouted in the very center of the field. But as time passed, an interesting distinction emerged. The plants growing at the edges were stronger. Their stems were thicker, their colors brighter, their leaves more vibrant. The plants in the center, while still alive, were slowly losing their strength. They weren't completely dead, but they were showing the signs of organisms under chronic stress in biology. Drooping, wilting, cessation of growth. Science tells us this: something alive can survive, but it cannot thrive. Humans are the same. Someone standing tall, going to work, talking, laughing. They may be inwardly exhausted. This is called silent exhaustion in modern psychology. Often, people are unaware that they are destroying themselves. Here, the image intensified. Suddenly, a gigantic hand appeared from the sky. This hand was not frightening. There was neither anger nor violence. On the contrary, with a determined and calm movement, it began to uproot the weakened plants. Interestingly, the strong ones remained untouched. Only those that were tired, unable to bear the weight, and could no longer grow were taken. At this point, the symbolic meaning of the narrative deepens even further. Because this scene, contrary to popular belief, is not a narrative of punishment. On the contrary, neuropsychology and trauma studies teach us that some systems, instead of protecting a structure under overload, remove it from the cycle. Sometimes this is a form of protection. The removal of the weak plants was not destruction. It was a transfer to another context. The strong ones remained there because they had the capacity to continue growing. This raises the question in human consciousness: who is truly being destroyed? Those who are taken, or those who are internally exhausted while continuing to live? When this vision ended, I turned to someone standing beside me, whom I will call Elena in this narrative. In real life, it had a different name, but what mattered here wasn't who it was, but the existence of a consciousness witnessing this experience. I told it what I had seen. Interestingly, what I described didn't sound foreign to it. Because when a person hears something that touches the truth, they recognize it physically, not mentally. The most disturbing aspect of this narrative is this: nobody is destroying anyone. People are slowly, unconsciously consuming themselves. Constantly suppressed emotions, rejected inner voices, unlived potential, ignored search for meaning. Neuroscience clearly shows that prolonged internal conflict weakens the immune system, accelerates cellular aging, and triggers mental collapse. Therefore, this is an urgent warning. But this warning isn't about an external threat. This warning is about the invisible self-sabotage that a person inflicts upon themselves. The difference between those who seem strong but are rotting from within and those who struggle and still succeed is where you stand. The edges represent the area outside the comfort zone. In psychology, this is where growth begins. The center, on the other hand, is the center of habits, crowds, and automatic life. Being where everyone else is seems safe, but in the long run, it drains the spirit. That's why the plants on the edge were stronger. They were fewer in number, but they were more vibrant. The truth of this narrative is, no one perishes, but not everyone can evolve. And a consciousness that cannot evolve eventually collapses from within. This is not a threat. It is a law of nature. Now the question is, which side are you on? Are you living or just surviving? And most importantly, are you one of those who are unknowingly destroying themselves? The second layer of the vision: who is taken, who stays? At this point, I must make a very clear distinction because this vision, when misunderstood, leads to fear. When understood correctly, it reveals a profound truth. This narrative is not about children, innocents, or those just beginning their journey. This narrative is about people who have walked the path of faith, served, paid the price, grown weary, and exhausted. Returning to my vision, I saw much more clearly that the uprooted plants were not chosen randomly. These were not people who had never known God. These were not people walking down the street who had not yet heard the call. These were people who had known Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, who had been born again, who had walked the path of faith, but who were now physically, mentally, and spiritually exhausted. There's a very important point here. This was not a scene of punishment. This was not a selection. This was a merciful calling, following a completed mission. From a theological perspective, the Bible contains many examples of God calling his servants to rest at different times. Elijah's weariness, Paul's words, "I have finished the race." Even Jesus himself saying to his disciples, "Come, let us rest a little." None of these are failures. These are signs of complete faithfulness. These plants in my vision were tired. They had fought, they had done their best, and they no longer had the strength to continue. Modern psychology calls this spiritual exhaustion. Theology calls it completed faithful service. God did not act harshly when uprooting these plants. On the contrary, it was like a mother putting her child to sleep from exhaustion, because it is not in God's nature to crush the faithful. Rest is given to the faithful. But the vision did not end there. The docile ones and the living but unproductive ones. The second and more difficult part of the vision concerned the plants that were still alive, but beginning to wither in the center. These were still green, still in the soil, but they had ceased to grow. There's a very delicate theological area here, and that's why I'm using the language carefully. These were people who claimed to believe in Christ, but who had filled most of their lives with purely worldly stimuli. Entertainment, consumption, constant distractions, had replaced spiritual discipline. This isn't being evil, it's superficiality. Scientifically, a mind constantly stimulated by dopamine loses its capacity to produce deep meaning. Spiritually, this is described as lukewarmness. This concept, mentioned in the book of Revelation, isn't something God dislikes, but rather a condition that erodes a person from within. The important correction here is, these people are not being destroyed by God. These people are rendering themselves dysfunctional. What Jesus said about rewards describes the depth of lived life, not salvation. Salvation is grace. The reward is the natural consequence of lived faithfulness. Therefore, these plants weren't completely uprooted, but they remained in the center and lost their power. What remained? Who were the powerful plants on the edges? And then there were the plants on the edges. Those who were few in number, those who weren't in the crowd, those who stood tall even when they were tired. These people, when they woke up in the morning, asked themselves this question: what do you want from me today? This question is defined in psychology as goal-oriented consciousness, and in theology as obedience consciousness. These people weren't perfect. They had fears. They were tired, but they hadn't lost their way. It wasn't a coincidence that I felt an intense warmth and weight in my body, especially in my arms and hands during the vision. Neuroscience tells us that when a person connects with a deep meaning, they produce intense signals in certain areas of the body. Theology calls this the testimony of the Holy Spirit. The message for these plants was clear. They will stay because their work is not yet finished. This is not chosenness. This is a state of readiness. God does not keep anyone because they are more worthy. God keeps those who can carry him. What is the real message of this narrative? This story was not told to create fear of who will be taken, who will stay. This story was told to show the truth. If a person is spiritually exhausted, if they have lost their connection to meaning, if they are living only by habit, they survive, but not in a true sense. What God does is not to exhaust people. However, it is also necessary not to force those who are exhausted to stay afloat. For those who survive, all that remains is this: not because they feel strong, but because they haven't lost their way. Enduring to the end, the misunderstood truth of salvation. Those who endure to the end will be saved. This saying is not meant to frighten, but to guide. Jesus used this expression not to place an unbearable burden on people's shoulders, but to redefine what perseverance means. Because the perseverance mentioned here is not about gritting your teeth, enduring pain, or denying yourself. The perseverance mentioned here is about not losing your way. It is beyond human comprehension to precisely say how God will eliminate the weak. No one can know for sure the form, the time, or the method. Throughout history, some have lost their lives, some have quietly withdrawn, and some have been invisibly removed from their duties. But there is a crucial point that needs to be corrected here. God does not punish anyone for being weak. God does not force those whose task is complete to remain in the struggle. This is also true in biology. In living systems, when a cell completes its function, it either differentiates or withdraws from the system. This is not an extinction, but a balancing mechanism. A similar principle operates on a spiritual level. God's aim is not to diminish the remnants, but to preserve those that are functional. The reality of the remnants, not scarcity, but burden-bearing capacity. There is a recurring concept throughout the Bible: the remnants. This does not mean a select elite group. It means a community small in number, but capable of bearing the burden. Sociology tells us that great changes are always accomplished by small but determined groups. Theology confirms this. These remnants are not perfect. They make mistakes. They get tired. Sometimes they want to escape. But they have one thing in common: they do not lose their way. Therefore, God always leaves a remnant to serve Him, because history is not built on a completely collapsed system. History progresses on a few remaining fundamental pillars. Spiritual reconstruction. Why change is inevitable? People will experience great changes during this period. This is not a sudden apocalypse. It is a profound reconstruction. You are part of the body of Christ, and as the body grows, it suffers. The nervous system reconnects. Muscles realign. Neuroscience teaches us that when the human brain is pulled in an unusual direction, it first produces resistance. This resistance is felt as fear. The same thing happens in spiritual life. When the Holy Spirit calls a person in directions they never planned, it initially creates confusion. Some of you will unexpectedly begin to hear certain words. Some thoughts will not feel like your own. You will say, "I wasn't like this before." This is where prayer begins. The question will be asked, "What does this mean?" And the answer will not be frightening. It will be explanatory. Because God does not abandon people to the unknown and does not leave them alone. While rearranging lives, He also provides meaning. The problem of displacement, cowardice, or obedience. Some people leave where they are. This is not an escape. Throughout history, God has told many people, "Leave where you are." He told Abraham, Lot, Jonah. This was not a sin. This was not a failure. This was an exit from a stage that had reached its end. There's a crucial psychological trap here. Society often labels displacement as cowardice. Yet developmental psychology states that a healthy individual can leave an environment where growth is no longer possible. This also applies to spiritual life. If God says, "Stay," stay. If He says, "Go," go. Obedience is not perseverance. It is the ability to adapt. The antidote to fear, knowing you are possessed. Do not fear, for I have saved you. I have called you by your name. You are mine. This is not a sentence spoken under threat. This is an expression of connection. In human psychology, the feeling of belonging is the strongest antidote to fear. A child fears the dark less when they know they are loved. God's love cannot be compared to human love, but it can be compared in terms of understanding. Just as a parent protects their child, God protects humanity. This doesn't mean you won't suffer. It means you won't be left alone. Water can be crossed. Fire can be crossed, but it cannot be overcome alone. The weary warrior's confession: wanting to leave is not a sin. And yes, it's hard to say, but necessary. Sometimes even the strongest say, "Enough." Sometimes the struggle seems worthless. Sometimes a person just wants to rest. This thought is not disbelief. It is a natural consequence of being human. Especially as one ages, the body loses strength. The mind slows down. This is not a collapse. It is a change of rhythm. The truth is, wanting to leave is not a sin. However, completely abandoning the path is dangerous. God does not keep anyone in an endless war. But at the same time, He does not encourage escape, which makes the war meaningless. The final truth: this is not a message of fear. This narrative is not a "who will be taken, who will stay" list. This narrative is a mirror for self-reflection. It's okay to be weak. It's okay to be tired, but to lose touch with meaning, that's the real danger. And those who remain in God's eyes are not the strongest, but the most faithful. The silent service. Within weariness, as we age, this process doesn't stop. On the contrary, it deepens. When we are young, we think strength lies in the muscles. As we age, we realize that strength is actually the capacity to endure. Sometimes I find myself thinking, if only I could be with you now, God. It's becoming increasingly difficult to stay here. This isn't a desire to escape. This is an honest confession of weariness. The pressure increases. The noise intensifies. People's expectations become heavier. And at some point, one asks, am I strong or weak? We often don't even know the answer to this question ourselves. But God knows, because He looks not at external performance, but at the intention in the heart. Psychology tells us that a person cannot objectively measure their own limits. Especially under stress, they perceive themselves as stronger or weaker than they actually are. However, the consciousness that created humanity is infallible in these limits. God knows how much weight we can carry and when we need to rest. Small but real service. Many people, when they say, I don't have a service, actually mean, I don't have a visible role. But real service is often hidden in things that are out of sight. Our narrator character, let's call her Elena here, has realized over the years, you don't have to address large crowds. You don't have to have a microphone. You don't have to have a stage. Sometimes service happens when no one notices. Elena started preparing small envelopes from time to time. She wrote short, simple sentences inside, not religious slogans, not fear-mongering messages, just calls for hope. Sometimes a verse, sometimes a sentence, sometimes just, you are not alone. She put a small booklet inside. And sometimes a very small amount of money, not large sums, $3 or $5, because it wasn't about the money. It was about connecting. Then, as she walked around the city, she would quietly pray, who do I need to touch today? Here's an important scientific fact. When the human brain encounters unexpected kindness, it releases neurotransmitters associated with hope. This can even cause a person to abandon suicide that very day. A seemingly small act can create a chain reaction. Elena's experience confirmed this. The person she gave the envelope to had tears in their eyes. Some cried. Others silently thanked her, because at that very moment, in that very place, they were seen by someone. Services everyone can offer. If you think you don't have a service to offer, you're wrong, because if you can speak, you can tell a story. If you can write, you can send a letter. If you can listen, you can heal. Studies on human relationships show that most people want to be listened to rather than lectured. Sometimes, talking to someone about Jesus is done not through a sermon, but through a moment of patience. Relatives, friends, people you haven't spoken to in years. The door is still open for them all. Service doesn't have to look religious. Sometimes service is simply about saying, I'm here. The world that knows you. God knows that beautiful brown world. This world, that is. The place where people walk. Its chaos, its ugliness, its weariness, and also its potential. Who you are matters. But not how you look, but what you carry matters. Not whether you are great or small. What matters is your loyalty. Theology teaches us this. Calling is not a profession. Calling is how a person exists where they are. Chosenness is not a privilege, but a responsibility. The consciousness that knows the beginning and the end. Don't be afraid. God knows your life from beginning to end. He knows not only the day you were born, but also the days you were tired. He also knows the time you will go. But this knowledge is not a threat. This knowledge is a reassurance. The human brain fears uncertainty, but it draws strength from meaning. And this path has meaning. Everything you experience is not in vain. We even know scientifically that when the human brain combines pain with meaning, its resilience increases. Heaven is not an escape route. Heaven is a result of a completed journey. The final call, just keep going. So find courage, not like a superhero, just like a human being. Keeping going doesn't always mean running. Keeping going sometimes means crawling, but without losing your way. Ask the Lord, what does this mean for my life? Sincere questions always find answers. Maybe not immediately, but in time. And remember, God will not forsake you. His face shines on you, and peace is closer than you think. Silent separation. Not everyone walks the same path. People often think that things like being in the same place, saying the same words, or expressing the same belief make them companions walking the same path. However, a closer look into the depths of life gradually reveals that physical proximity does not express a unity at a conscious level. While the human body can move through crowds, the mind and awareness follow a much quieter, more individual path. This is precisely where the process we call silent separation begins, an inner change that no one loudly proclaims, that no one wants to be noticed, and that often the person themselves cannot even explicitly name. This separation usually doesn't happen through a dramatic event. There is neither a great break nor a sudden separation. Rather, it takes shape within the ordinary rhythm of daily life, as a sum of small choices, recurring habits, and subtly shifting priorities. Two people sitting at the same table, listening to the same words, participating in the same rituals, can develop completely different inner worlds over time. One deepens their understanding, while the other maintains their habits. Although everything may seem the same from the outside, internally the directions have already diverged. From a scientific point of view, this is not surprising. Neuroscience and behavioral psychology state that one of the fundamental working principles of the human brain is to redistribute its energy according to its value system. When what a person considers important in life changes, the brain subtly reflects this in behavioral patterns. For example, as a person takes their search for meaning to a deeper level, their attention span, decision-making style, and emotional responses gradually diverge. From the outside, this change is often interpreted as tiredness, cooling off, or distance. However, what is actually happening is a shift in direction at a conscious level. The most striking aspect of this silent dissociation is that it occurs without explicitly excluding anyone. People are still in the same environment, speaking the same language, and even believing they share the same goals. But their inner orientation is no longer the same. Some begin to understand the meaning of what they believe more deeply, while others continue to carry that belief as a part of their lives without questioning or deepening it. At this point, the dissociation ceases to be a matter of good-bad or right-wrong. It becomes entirely about conscious capacity and inner readiness. Experientially, many people going through this process express a similar feeling. I'm in the same place, but it's as if I'm no longer at the same point. This feeling often leads to a mixture of loneliness and unease. Because while the person remains within the structure they believe they belong to, they feel internally pulled into another depth. In psychology, this is called cognitive and existential dissonance. When the distance between a person's external environment and their inner world widens, either a loss of energy or conversely, an inner strengthening can occur. What happens is directly related to how the person interprets this difference. From a spiritual perspective, silent separation is often seen not as an elimination or exclusion, but as a natural process of deepening. A common principle in most spiritual teachings is, there is no coercion. No one is pulled, no one is pushed. Only those who are ready deepen. This does not mean that God or divine order forcibly transforms people. Rather, it is the transition of those who are internally ready as a natural consequence of their awareness to a deeper realm of responsibility and consciousness. Therefore, some appear stronger, while others appear exhausted, because not everyone is ready to delve to the same depth at the same time. The term burnout here is often misunderstood. A decrease in a person's energy doesn't always mean weakness or failure. Sometimes, it's the result of a conflict between a person's inner orientation and external expectations. Scientific studies show that individuals who live a life inconsistent with their own values for a long time experience chronic fatigue, loss of motivation, and emotional numbness. Therefore, a burnt-out person isn't necessarily someone who is less convinced. Sometimes it's simply someone who can't understand their surroundings more deeply. At this point, the silent detachment process becomes most apparent. Some people, upon noticing this difference, withdraw, speak less, and observe more. While this might be perceived as an outward detachment, it is actually an internal concentration. Others, upon feeling the same difference, choose to suppress it. They cling more tightly to their old habits and prefer to remain on the surface. These two different reactions ultimately lead to different outcomes. The fundamental truth of this section is this: although everyone seems to be walking the same path, not everyone is moving in the same direction. Sometimes the paths run parallel, and sometimes they diverge silently. This divergence is neither a punishment nor a reward. It is a natural consequence of a person's inner readiness. Some gain deeper understanding and become stronger in this process, while others become exhausted because they have not yet created the space to carry that same depth. Silent divergence is the name given to this difference, and here we find the first but most fundamental answer to the question, why do some become stronger while others become exhausted? Because even if everyone is in the same place, they are not at the same level of consciousness. Fatigue is not a sin, the spiritual anatomy of burnout. At this point, a very delicate and vital balance needs to be struck, because one of the heaviest burdens that grows unnoticed in the inner world of many people is the tendency to view fatigue as a moral flaw or a spiritual deficiency, whereas when we delve deeper, we see that fatigue is often not a sign of disloyalty, but rather a natural consequence of a deep sense of responsibility and conscience. A person doesn't fall because they are tired. Rather, they become exhausted from trying to stand for too long. There is a common misconception in spiritual narratives, and especially in faith-based communities. It is thought that the strong must always endure, never stop, and never stumble. This perspective perceives fatigue as a sign of weakness. However, in real life and human psychology, the situation is quite the opposite. Numerous scientific studies on burnout syndrome reveal that those who experience burnout and are the most tired are often the ones who take on the most responsibility, show the most empathy, and give the most. Therefore, those who experience burnout are often not the indifferent ones, but the overly anxious ones. Neuroscience explains this quite clearly. When the human brain constantly focuses on the needs of others, especially when it does so by neglecting its own limitations, the alarm system remains constantly active. The brain's stress-related areas, specifically the balance between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, begin to malfunction during prolonged periods of wakefulness. This manifests as mental fatigue, emotional numbness, loss of motivation, and even physical weakness. Therefore, many symptoms of burnout that seem psychological are actually supported by very concrete and measurable biological processes. The important point here is this: fatigue is not a matter of faith. Fatigue is an inevitable part of being human. Being faithful does not mean having unlimited energy. In fact, a careful examination of sacred texts clearly reveals this fact. When we look at the life of Jesus, there are clear accounts of moments when he withdrew from the crowd, sought solitude, rested, and needed silence. These moments were not a retreat or an escape from duty, but rather a conscious process of renewal. This detail is crucial because here we are faced with a misinterpretation of spiritual exhaustion. If even Jesus chose to withdraw from the crowd, what sense does it make for someone to feel guilty for doing so? Resting, withdrawing, or remaining silent is not a deviation from a divine calling. Sometimes it is the calling itself. Because a person has a capacity to carry, and when this capacity is ignored, even the strongest intentions wear down over time. From a spiritual perspective, God's calling some people to rest does not mean rejecting or casting them aside. On the contrary, it is often a form of protection. From an experiential perspective, it is observed that individuals who have served for many years, taken responsibility, and put themselves in the background for others need an inner pause at a certain point. Although this pause is perceived as withdrawal from the outside world, it is actually a process of deep healing. Here, it is necessary to correctly understand the spiritual anatomy of burnout. Burnout usually stems not from being on the wrong path, but from carrying too much weight. When a person continues to give without recognizing their own limits, no matter how pure their spiritual intentions, the body and mind cannot carry this burden forever. In psychology, this is called compassion fatigue. It is especially common in people who help, guide, or constantly support others. Therefore, the most important message of this episode is: fatigue does not make you worthless. Burnout is not disloyalty. Rather, it is often a natural consequence of deep loyalty, long-term commitment, and the neglect of boundaries. Guilt exacerbates this process because the person is both exhausted and judges themselves for this exhaustion. This is where compassion should come in. Showing self-compassion is not a weakness in the spiritual journey, but one of its most mature stages. Because when a person can accept their own vulnerability, they can approach others with more genuine compassion. From God's perspective, fatigue is not a flaw, but a sign. a sign saying, "Stop, breathe, readjust your burden." This episode exists to help the viewer cleanse themselves of the silent guilt within. Because while some become exhausted trying to stay strong, others feel inadequate because they choose to rest. But the truth is, resting is not giving up. Sometimes resting is the only way to keep going. And the spiritual journey progresses by transforming the individual, not by exhausting them. The remaining consciousness. Why are so few silent? The concept of the remaining is often misunderstood. It's associated with marginalization, exclusion, or a sense of loss. But the remaining we're talking about here stems not from fear, but from a burden. Being a remaining person isn't a sign of privilege. It's the capacity to shoulder a heavy weight. Everyone can walk in the crowd, but not everyone can stand after the wreckage. That's why so few remain, and this scarcity isn't a deficiency, but a recurring law of nature and history. Historically, great uprisings, radical transformations, and the beginnings of new eras have never been driven by large masses. Whether you look at the history of beliefs, intellectual movements, or social revolutions, those who take the first step and those who remain have always been small groups. Because while the majority maintains the established order, the minority finds its way when the order breaks down. This is where the remaining consciousness comes into play. Sociology explains this quite clearly. Statistically, those who initiate social change are usually the silent minority. These people don't speak loudly, they don't seek the applause of crowds, and they don't aim to be seen. Their strength comes not from numbers, but from resilience. Individuals with a sense of belonging go unnoticed while the system is functioning, because the system already makes them invisible. But when the system collapses, when direction is sought, when the noise subsides, they are the ones who remain. This silence is not shyness, but introversion. The people who remain are humble because they have built their strength from within, not from without. They are shaped to endure, not to shine. That's why they stay in the background during crowded times, but they come to the forefront during times of crisis. Because in times of panic, loud voices don't produce solutions, they create strong roots. One of the most striking characteristics of staying in the background is invisibility. These people are often unnoticed, unappreciated, and sometimes misunderstood. They are labeled as too quiet, too background, too lonely. But this invisibility is not an escape, but a preparation. Deep roots are invisible on the surface, but when the storm comes, they are the ones who stand tall. Strong plants are not always the fastest growing. They are the ones who put down the deepest roots. At this point, it is necessary to clarify a very important fact. Survival should not be confused with narratives of chosenness. It is not a us versus them distinction. The consciousness of survival does not claim superiority. On the contrary, it expresses a greater burden, a greater responsibility, and often a greater loneliness. Because very few people go unnoticed, yet they are the first to feel the collapse and the last to recover. This difference becomes even more apparent in times of crisis. When the crowds disperse, panic spreads, and the old structure collapses, those who remain are often the silent ones, because they did not derive their strength from external validation. They learned to wait, to be steadfast, and to stand tall in difficult times. That is why the carriers of great transformations are often people whose names are unknown, whose stories are not told, but whose effects last for a long time. This section explains why strong plants still stand, because some are created not for rapid growth, but for longevity. The consciousness of survivors is the consciousness of those who have escaped the brink of extinction. They are silent because they do not need to shout. They are few in number because they carry a heavy burden, and they seem to be left behind. But in reality, they are the bearers of the world after the storm. Displacement and change of direction, escape or call. There are moments in a person's life when their current location ceases to be merely a place and becomes a space that restricts the mind, exhausts the spirit, and keeps the body constantly on alert. The desire for change that arises at this point is often mislabeled. The person asks themselves, "Am I fleeing or am I being called?" However, although these two concepts may seem similar from the outside, they operate with completely different dynamics internally. Moving away from life doesn't always mean escaping duty. Sometimes, on the contrary, it means the duty changing shape. Most people perceive displacement as a physical movement, moving to another city, quitting a job, starting a new life. But on a deeper level, real change often occurs not on the map, but in consciousness. What God asks of some people is not a change of address, but a change of perception, priorities, and direction. There are people who remain physically in the same place, but psychologically move to a completely different state. This may not be noticeable from the outside, but it initiates a profound restructuring within their inner world. Many of the journeys described in sacred texts begin precisely with this inner resistance. Abraham's departure wasn't just a change of land. It was about leaving behind habits, comfort zones, and familiar identities. Lot's departure wasn't just about leaving a city, but about confronting a system of values. Jonah's escape is one of the most striking examples. He physically tried to go in another direction, but the real problem was his resistance to the inner calling. The common thread in these stories is this: when the call for change comes, a person's first reaction is usually resistance, because the unknown is always perceived as a threat. In modern life, this call comes much more quietly. No one is told, "Go to that country" anymore. Instead, unease begins in one's inner world. Meaning is lost while working in the same job. Mental fatigue increases in the same environment, and the feeling of loneliness deepens even in a crowd. At this point, some people interpret this as laziness, indecisiveness, or disloyalty. However, these signals are often harbingers of a change of direction. Changing jobs, simplifying one's environment, reducing social interactions, or withdrawing into conscious solitude. These are forms of displacement in the modern age. From a scientific perspective, the impact of environmental change on the human nervous system is quite clear. A brain constantly exposed to the same stimuli will, after a while, keep its alarm system constantly active. This manifests as chronic stress, burnout, and emotional numbness. Neuroscience suggests that a new environment, or at least a decrease in stimulus intensity, allows the brain to reorganize. This reorganization enables a shift from a threat-focused mode to a mode open to learning and awareness. Therefore, sometimes a step back is necessary for the system to repair itself. The critical point here is this: escape is driven by the intention of distancing oneself from responsibility. The call, on the other hand, is the continuation of responsibility in another form. The person who escapes is restless everywhere because they carry an inner void. The person who is called, even if they experience temporary uncertainty, carries a deep sense of righteousness. Everything is not clear, but there's a sense of direction. This difference cannot be measured externally. However, the person knows it within themselves. Displacement sometimes manifests itself as a quiet simplification, talking less, sharing less, being less visible. This too is a change of direction, because people cannot live at the same pace, intensity, and level of social interaction in every era. There are times when it is impossible for external production to continue without strengthening the inner structure. That's why some people withdraw for a while. This withdrawal is not a collapse, but a repositioning. The most important awareness this section offers the viewer is this: if you are experiencing a recurring feeling of restlessness, meaninglessness, or inner stagnation in your life, you don't have to immediately interpret these as, "I'm on the wrong path." Perhaps trying to stay on the same path is turning the call into an escape. Sometimes God pulls a person sideways, not forward. He invites them not to become more visible, but to go deeper. Changing direction doesn't always require dramatic decisions. Sometimes it's enough to give up a point of view, relinquish an expectation, or accept not going in the direction everyone else is going. Because the real journey is less about the steps a person takes in the external world and more about the changes they bravely accept in their inner world. And if this change is not an escape, it is usually a calling. Ultimate resilience, a new definition of perseverance. Most people who face life's challenges associate enduring with gritting their teeth, hiding their tears, and pushing themselves, physical and mental effort. But true resilience is a far more nuanced and profound process than these old definitions. Enduring no longer simply means forcing oneself to endure. It means slowing down without losing direction, moving at one's own pace, and gaining the ability to progress without straining oneself. The human spirit tires when compressed and strained, but a consciousness that knows its direction, understands its cause, and remembers its purpose can endure suffering for a long time and draw strength from the profound inner power that this resilience brings. Many of us measure struggles only physically or emotionally, but in God's eyes, true strength lies not in speed, but in stability. This doesn't mean constantly moving or always appearing strong. Rather, it involves slowing down, pausing, and maintaining inner balance. When a person understands the cause of a task or challenge, their spirit becomes attached to it, and this attachment increases their capacity to endure, even under difficult circumstances. From a sacred perspective, this isn't the perfection that God desires. It's about not giving up, not surrendering, and remembering the path. Throughout history, believers have frequently gone through periods that tested their strength and patience. Some appear worn down, exhausted, and even weakened in their struggles. But this weariness is not a failure. It is a process of restructuring and gaining inner strength. When God measures resilience, He looks not at a person's outward appearance, but at their intention and the faithfulness in their heart. Resilience is no longer a visible display of heroism. It is a state of quiet, conscious, and constant commitment. In this process, people often discover their own limits. They understand the true meaning of pain, weariness, and hardship. situations that previously seemed unbearable become testing grounds. The spirit and consciousness mature by learning from trials. When a person knows the cause of the suffering and the task they have long been working on, they can endure the suffering longer. This is true strength, a strength driven by inner determination, independent of environmental conditions. Resilience sometimes requires slowing down and taking a breath. There's no need to rush. The important thing is to keep moving forward without losing your way. This is necessary to align with God's plan. Even in difficult times, pausing, breathing, and regaining balance allows you to continue on your path more firmly and consciously. Therefore, resilience is no longer a sign of distress, but a wisdom and strategy. Finally, from God's perspective, continuing doesn't mean perfection. Mistakes, shortcomings, and fatigue are a natural part of this journey. The important thing is to stay on the path, not give up, and not forget your purpose. God finds even those who seem weak valuable as long as they don't give up, and guides them in the best way. With this awareness, resilience becomes a source of true hope and resistance without the need for false motivations. The follower's task is to understand their own limits and abilities, not to be afraid to slow down, and to keep moving forward without losing their inner direction. This awareness provides confidence and determination not only in difficult times, but in every moment of daily life. Because what God seeks is not strength, but perseverance and staying on the right path. And this awareness brings true resilience and freedom in all areas of life.